In a big city where no one usually looks at anyone, a millionaire and widowed businesswoman decides to break her impeccable routine without imagining that this simple gesture would change everything. A hungry young man, with a voice almost extinguished by shame, makes a humble request that pierces straight through the barriers of a heart closed for years. Between judgmental looks, glaring social differences, and deep emotional wounds, an improbable connection is born, too intense to be ignored. But when feelings begin to emerge where only compassion should exist, both are forced to face choices that can change their lives forever. Before diving into this moving story of new beginnings, judgments, and an unexpected love, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell for more stories that touch the heart. Donna Amelia Bakery was on the corner of Rua Harmonia and Teodoro Sampaio in Pinheiros, and had the kind of facade that the city of São Paulo was gradually forgetting. Cream-colored Portuguese tiles, a dark green painted wooden door, and the smell of fresh bread invading the sidewalk since 6 in the morning. It was the kind of place that didn't suit Lucia Fontanelle, not because she was a snob, although many people thought so, but because her routine rarely allowed her to stop anywhere that wasn't planned in advance. On that Tuesday morning, however, something in Lucia's trajectory had broken without warning. The driver called 20 minutes late. The cell phone rang at 10 to 6 with a message from the board of directors that she chose not to answer, and the bathroom mirror returned a face she didn't immediately recognize. 52 years old, black hair still resistant to time, brown eyes with a depth that some people confused with haughtiness. But that morning, there was no haughtiness. There was fatigue. There was a silence inside the apartment on Alameda Joaquim Eugenio de Lima that weighed more than any meeting she would face that day. She sent the driver away. She grabbed her purse, went down the 22 floors by elevator, and walked out with no set destination. In 15 minutes, she was on Teodoro Sampaio, and the smell of bread did the rest. Donna Amelia had round marble tables, white-painted iron chairs, and an employee named Bernadette, who served coffee with the naturalness of someone who has been doing the same thing for 30 years. Lucia sat near the window, ordered a coffee with milk and a slice of toasted sandwich bread, and stared at the sidewalk as if searching for something in the movement of the street. It was at that moment that he appeared. He was approximately 30 years old, maybe less. It was hard to tell because his face bore marks that life in the open air imprints faster than time. Dark hair tied with a worn-out elastic band, an unshaven beard that had passed neglect and entered the territory of abandonment, amber brown eyes that even with evident fatigue held something alive. He wore a faded t-shirt of an indefinite color and jeans with rips that weren't for fashion. He stopped before the bakery door and stared inside with an expression that Lucia identified even before he opened his mouth. It was the expression of someone assessing whether they have the right to enter somewhere. He entered. With slow steps, without looking at anyone, he went to the counter. Bernadette watched him with that mixture of caution and compassion that people learn after years of serving the public in São Paulo. He said something in a low voice. Bernadette shook her head negatively with an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that Lucia caught from the table where she was. Then he turned, and before leaving, his eyes crossed with Lucia's. It wasn't a look of a request. It was the look of someone who was caught in the exact moment of realizing they are at the bottom. There was shame there, but also a wounded dignity, that kind of pride that survives even when everything else goes away. He quickly averted his eyes and took a step toward the door. "Wait," Lucia said. The word came out before she thought. He stopped. He turned slowly, as if unsure if he had heard or if he was making up voices. "What did you ask for?" she asked. He looked at her for a full second before answering. "Just a bread, ma'am, nothing more." Lucia made a discreet gesture to Bernadette, who already understood that kind of language. Then she pointed to the empty chair on the other side of her table. "Sit down." He hesitated. The internal conflict was visible, that clash between urgent need and the pride that resists even to the extreme. Finally, he pulled out the chair and sat on the very edge, as if he needed to maintain the possibility of escape. Bernadette brought a coffee with milk, cheese bread, a generous slice of corn cake and butter. She placed everything without ceremony, as if it were the most natural order in the world. He looked at the tray, and something in his face changed. It wasn't an exhibited gratitude, no emotional theater. It was just a relaxation of the facial muscles, as if his entire body exhaled a relief that came from much further away than that morning. He ate slowly, carefully, despite his evident hunger. Lucia drank her coffee without haste and looked at the street. She didn't stare at him directly because she understood, without anyone explaining, that he needed that space, to be seen without being examined. "What is your name?" she asked after a few minutes, still looking at the window. "Raphael," he said. "How long have you been on the streets, Raphael?" A pause. 4 months. Lucia lightly swirled the cup on the saucer. 4 months was enough time to erase a lot, enough time to make a person forget what it was like to sleep in a bed or wake up without fear of the day ahead. "You don't need to do this," he said suddenly, with a surprising firmness in his voice. "I am not asking for anything else." She looked at him directly for the first time at that moment. He held her gaze for an instant, and then looked away, but not out of shame. He looked away because there was something in that contact that both of them still didn't know how to name. "I know you're not asking," she replied calmly. "I am offering. Those are different things." Raphael finished his coffee in silence. Lucia ordered another round of cheese bread without asking if he wanted it. He didn't refuse. Outside, Teodoro Sampaio was already waking up at the accelerated pace that São Paulo imposes early on, motorcycles delivering boxes, people walking with their heads down on their cell phones, buses panting at the stops. Life followed its usual speed while at that table, between 2 cups of coffee with milk, something began to move at a completely different rhythm. When he finished, he made a gesture to stand up. Lucia opened her purse and took out some bills, but he pulled back his hand with a subtle movement. "The bread was enough," he said. She put the bills back in her purse without insisting, but as he stood up, she said, "I will be here tomorrow, at the same time, in case you want to have a coffee." Raphael stood still for a second. He said neither yes nor no. He just nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, and went out through the green wooden door with the same cautious step he had entered with. Lucia stared at the empty chair for a long time. Bernadette reappeared to collect the cups and said nothing, but there was a corner of a smile on her lips that Lucia pretended not to notice. She left the bakery 15 minutes later than she should have for the first meeting of the day. As she walked back along Teodoro Sampaio, she noticed that the weight she had woken up with that morning was slightly different. It hadn't disappeared, but it had moved, like a stone someone pushes from its place without yet knowing where to. Lucia Fontenelle arrived at the office of Fontenelle Incorporações 40 minutes late, which in 12 years of management had never happened. Her assistant, Camila, a 28-year-old woman with the efficiency of a living planner, was at the office door with an expression that tried to hide her surprise. "The board meeting was rescheduled for 10, she said carefully, as if delivering delicate news. Lucia passed her without slowing down, dropped her purse on the leather armchair, and stood before the panoramic window looking at Avenida Brigadeiro Faria Lima below. São Paulo at 8:30 in the morning was a painting in motion. Cars, people, cranes on the horizon, the constant hum of a city that never stopped building itself. Lucia had loved this view for years. It was concrete proof that what she and Antonio built together had survived, grown, branched out. Fontenelle had started as a medium-sized construction company in the ABC Paulista region, and in 20 years it had become one of the main real estate development groups in the capital, with residential projects in Pinheiros, Itaimbibi, Moema, and Alphaville. Antonio died 3 years ago, leaving a void that neither the company nor the luxury apartment nor the scheduled commitments could fill. "Camila," she said without turning, "cancel the lunch with Dr. Mauricio." A pause. "Mr. Mauricio Brandão." The lunch was scheduled to confirm the partnership for the Morumbi development. "I know which one it is. Reschedule it for next week." She heard the discreet sound of the door closing and was left alone. She took her cell phone, opened her messages, and stared at the screen without really reading anything. Raphael's face returned without her inviting it. It wasn't a handsome face in the conventional sense, but it was an honest face, and it had been a long time since she had found honesty with such clarity in any face that crossed her life. In the meeting room, there were calculating faces. At social events, performative faces. In the mirror lately, an exhausted face. Raphael had the face of someone who had nothing left to hide because he had already lost everything. She wondered where he was at that moment. The 10 o'clock meeting proceeded with the usual coldness. The board wanted to discuss the expansion to the northern coast, a proposal that Lucia herself had presented in the previous quarter, but that morning she heard it as if it were a conversation in another language. She responded with precision, signed what needed to be signed, and at 12:30 she was back in her car, asking the driver to take her to Pinheiros. "Any specific address, Donna Lucia?" "Teodoro Sampaio," she said. And then, with a naturalness that surprised her, she added, "I'm stopping by the bakery." Raphael was sitting on the curb half a block from Donna Amelia when she turned the corner. He didn't see her immediately. He was leaning his back against the wall of a closed business, arms over his knees, looking at the asphalt. There was something very quiet about him, a withdrawal that wasn't passivity, but a form of silent resistance to the world that moved forward without caring about who was stationary. Lucia ordered the car to park and got out before doubt arrived. "Raphael." He raised his head. There was a fraction of a second of hesitation, that moment when a person recognizes someone but doesn't yet know if the memory is reliable, and then recognition settled on his face with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but approached something in that direction. "Ma'am," he said, standing up with a certain haste. "Lucia," she corrected. "You can call me Lucia." He didn't repeat the name. He stood with a posture that tried to hide the body's fatigue. She looked at him attentively, the same attention she used to evaluate a project before signing, and made a decision before weighing all the variables. "Do you need a place to sleep tonight?" The question was direct because Lucia didn't know how to be any other way. Raphael opened his mouth and closed it. There was pride there still, a wounded pride that tried to stand up even without a firm base. "I'll manage," he said. "I didn't ask if you'll manage. I asked if you need a place to sleep." He looked away to the sidewalk. The silence lasted long enough for both of them to know that the answer was yes. "There's a small hotel here on Amari," she said, in the neutral tone of someone solving a logistical issue. "Clean, discreet, it's no mansion, but it has a bed, a hot shower, and breakfast. I'll leave your name at the reception. 3 nights, so you have time to breathe and think about the next step." Raphael stared at her for a time that most people would find uncomfortable. She held it without blinking. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. His voice had no aggressiveness. It had genuine incomprehension. Lucia thought about the answer before giving it. She could say it was philanthropy. She could say she had seen an article in the newspaper about the homeless population in São Paulo, that there were more than 40,000 people, and that maybe it was time to do something concrete. But none of those answers were true. "Because you asked for only a bread," she said, "and it had been years since someone asked me for something I could actually give." Raphael was silent. There was no way to answer that with words, and he seemed to know it. He nodded his head slowly, like someone accepting a weight they didn't expect, but recognized as necessary. The Chalet d'Amaury Hotel was exactly what Lucia had described: discreet, unpretentious but honest in what it offered. The receptionist, a lady named Glorinha, already knew Lucia from other kindnesses over the years and received Raphael without any questions beyond his name. Lucia paid for 3 nights in advance, left a contact number, and left before he could formally thank her, because she sensed he would need time to assimilate everything without witnesses. In the car back, Camilla called 3 times. Lucia answered on the 3rd. There was an urgent email from the legal department, a rescheduled interview for the afternoon, and a message from the architect responsible for the Morumbi project. She answered everything with her usual objectivity, but part of her attention was on that small hotel on Rua Amaury, in a room she hadn't even seen, where a man named Raphael was probably sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to understand what had happened to his day. She smiled slightly. It was a small smile, almost involuntary, that Lucia didn't realize she was making until the driver observed her through the rearview mirror with a discreet expression of surprise. How long had it been since she smiled for no reason? 3 years, perhaps. Exactly 3 years. And it was curious, she thought as the car entered Faria Lima, that it wasn't a business achievement that had broken that fast of joy, nor a lunch among friends, nor the view from the 22nd floor window. It was a 30-year-old man sitting on a curb, with a face weathered by the sun, and eyes that still held a spark of something she didn't know how to name, but that she recognized as rare, as real, as the kind of thing that São Paulo hid under all its speed and that sometimes appeared by surprise on the corner of Teodoro Sampaio on a Tuesday morning. The next morning, Lucia arrived at Donna Amelia at 7 sharp. Bernadette was already waiting for her with the coffee with milk and toasted bread, as if the previous Tuesday had established a protocol. Lucia sat in the same place near the window and stared at the green wooden door without realizing she was doing it. Raphael appeared at 7:18. She heard the sound of the doorknob before raising her head. He was different. Not completely, but enough that the change was noticeable. He had showered, his beard was trimmed, his hair loose and still damp. He wore the same faded t-shirt, but it had been washed, and there was a slightly firmer posture in his shoulders, as if a decent night's sleep had returned something the body had lost from lack of rest. He saw her sitting and went to the table without hesitation this time, which in itself was already a difference. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Raphael." Bernadette reappeared with a tray identical to the day before. Raphael looked at the food and then at Lucia with a gesture of gratitude that he didn't put into words, but that was entirely in that look. They ate in silence for a while. It was a different silence than the first day, less tense with more space. Outside, a mother pushed a stroller, 2 young people on bicycles cut across the sidewalk, and an elderly man in a hat stopped to buy a newspaper at the corner stand. The ordinary life of Pinheiros at 7 in the morning, indifferent to everything but itself. "How was the night?" she asked. He took a moment to answer. "It took me a while to fall asleep." "Was the bed bad?" "The bed was great." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "It's been a long time since I slept in a bed. My body didn't know what to do with it anymore." Lucia nodded without commenting. There was something in that kind of simple honesty that completely disarmed her. In the meetings she attended, people used words like shields. Raphael used words like windows. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" she asked after a moment. "How did you end up in this situation?" He set down his cup. He looked at the table, then at her, and Lucia waited without haste. She had learned from Antonio in the years of marriage that some stories needed silence before beginning. "I came from Ribeirão Preto," he said at last. 2 years ago. I had a job offer at a logistics company in Tatuapé, well-structured, with everything registered, salary above average. I spent 3 weeks preparing, borrowed money to cover the first months of rent here, rented a room in Ermelino Matarazzo." He paused. "On the first day of work, I arrived at the address, and the place didn't exist. It was an empty warehouse. The company was fake. The whole selection process, the emails, the documents, everything was a setup to extract money from those who needed a job." Lucia closed her eyes slightly for a second. She knew about that kind of scheme. She had read articles, signed notes of repudiation in business associations, participated in awareness campaigns, but it was different hearing it from someone sitting on the other side of the table. "I lost the borrowed money. I lost the room because I couldn't pay the second month. I stayed for a few days at the house of an acquaintance who then traveled and didn't know when he would be back." He made a brief pause. "And then there was no place left." "And in Ribeirão, family?" He looked at the window. "My mother. But she has her own life to take care of. I didn't want to be a burden." His voice was firm, but there was something underneath that she didn't press. Lucia was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have any training?" "Administrative technician. I worked for 5 years in a credit union in Ribeirão before coming here." She nodded slowly, processing. There was a competence there that the situation had buried but not destroyed. She knew this kind of profile. People who fell because of circumstances, not for lack of capacity. The difference between those who stayed on the ground and those who returned was often just the presence or absence of an outstretched hand at the right moment. 3 nights are not enough, she said suddenly. Raphael looked at her without understanding. At the hotel, she explained, I'm going to extend it to 2 weeks. That will give you time to organize documentation, think of a strategy, truly rest. She opened her purse and placed a simple card on the table with no company name, just a cell phone number written by hand. If you need anything, call me. I'm not in the habit of leaving things halfway. He looked at the card but didn't pick it up immediately. There was a visible struggle on his face, that clash between what pride told him to do and what reason indicated as necessary. I will pay you back, he said. His voice had a resolution that admitted no debate. Everything, every cent. I didn't ask for that. I am saying it even without you asking. Their eyes met, and there was a kind of contract there that didn't need a signature. Lucia felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Immediate respect for someone she had just met. It wasn't admiration built over negotiations or strategic positioning. It was the direct, almost instinctive recognition of an integrity that remained standing even when the ground had disappeared. He picked up the card. She finished her coffee, left enough money on the table to cover both of them, and stood up. Tomorrow there's breakfast again if you want, she said, with the lightness of someone making a simple invitation. Raphael watched her leave through the green wooden door. He held the card between his fingers, turning it slowly, like someone testing the weight of a decision they still didn't quite know what it would cost. Bernadette passed by the table to collect the cups and, without looking at him directly, said in the low voice of someone sharing wisdom that no one asked for, "She is a good person. One of the rare ones." Raphael didn't answer, but he folded the card carefully and put it in his pants pocket as if it was something he couldn't lose. Outside, Lucia walked back along Teodoro Sampaio with a firmer step than the previous morning. She had made a decision without planning, without a spreadsheet, without a board of directors, and that was something she had stopped doing a long time ago. Antonio always said that the best things they had done together had not been planned. She had forgotten that, somewhere between quarterly reports and the silence of the 22-story apartment. But now, on the sidewalk of Pinheiros, with the smell of cheese bread still stuck to her clothes, she remembered, and the memory didn't hurt as it used to. This time, it came accompanied by something slightly different, like a sliver of light under a door closed for too long. She didn't yet know what was on the other side of that door, but for the first time in 3 years, she was walking toward it without feeling that she needed to justify herself for it, without weighing the consequences, without scaling the gesture into a risk analysis model. She just walked, and that in itself was already a way to begin. The news that Lucia Fontanelle was frequenting a bakery in Pinheiros would not take long to circulate. São Paulo was a huge city, but the social circles of the São Paulo elite had the intimacy of a small town, and any detour from the route of a figure like her became a subject in less time than she would like. It was Renata Vilhena who brought the first comment. Renata was a partner in an investment fund, was 5 years younger than Lucia, and had been at some point something close to a friend, although that term never quite fit the relationships Lucia cultivated in that circle. They met on Thursday afternoon at an art gallery in Higienopolis for an exhibition opening cocktail. Renata came up from behind with a kiss in the air and a glass of sparkling wine already in hand. "I heard you've been frequenting Teodoro Sampaio in the morning," she said in the tone of someone sharing innocent curiosity. "Claudia Mireles saw you leaving a bakery with a young man." She was curious. Lucia took a glass from the passing tray. "Claudia should use that curiosity for something more productive." Renata smiled with her teeth. "You don't need to tell me anything, but you know how it is. People talk." "People always talk," Lucia replied, with a calmness that left no openings. "It's what they do when they have nothing else interesting to do." Renata retreated with a little laugh and went to greet someone else. Lucia stood before a large canvas, an abstract painting in shades of amber and grey, and drank the sparkling wine slowly while processing what had just happened. It wasn't a surprise. It was irritation. the calm irritation of someone who already knows that certain people never change. That same afternoon, Raphael had sent a message to the number on the card. It was short, with the economy of words of someone who wasn't used to asking for anything. I need to renew my ID. My documents were in a backpack that disappeared during a week of rain. Is there a way to guide me through the process? Lucia replied with the name and address of a trusted agent who would resolve everything without bureaucracy, and added that the costs were covered. His response came 2 minutes later. Thank you, I will pay it back. She put her phone away with a smile she didn't show to anyone. On Friday morning, the two met again at Donna Emilia. This time, Raphael arrived first. She found him already sitting at the table, with 2 cups ordered and a cheese bread carefully split in half, as if he were reserving the spot. It was a small gesture, but she noticed it. There was a change in the dynamic, subtle but real, like when a team starts working together without needing to coordinate their movements anymore. The documents will be ready on Tuesday, he said when she sat down. Great. With the ID, you can open an account and regularize your work permit. He nodded. There was an objectivity in the way he conducted these practical conversations, as if the whole situation were a technical problem to be solved in stages. Lucia recognized this mechanism. She herself had used it for years, so as not to feel too much the things life threw at her. Solve the concrete first. The rest comes later, or it doesn't. Have you thought about what you want to do while the documents aren't ready? She asked. I've been walking around the neighborhood these days, he said. I saw a help wanted sign at a construction supply store on Teodoro. I went in, talked to the owner. It's clerk work. But Mr. Carlo said he needed someone who knew how to do math and handle customers, not just carry weight. Lucia looked at him with curiosity. And what happened? He asked for documents. A corner of a smile. I said I was regularizing them. He said if I came back next week with my ID and work permit, there was a vacancy. And you went back without documents because you wanted to test if the conversation was real, she said, more as a statement than a question. Yes. He looked at her directly. I learned it's better to confirm before investing hope. There was a silent maturity in that which touched her. 4 months on the street could destroy a person, or in certain cases, forge a clarity that no classroom taught. Raphael seemed to have gone through the experience with broken bones, but his essence intact. This Carlo, she said after a moment, what is the store like? Martin's Construction Supplies on Teodoro and Artur de Azevedo. It's been there for about 20 years by the looks of it. Mr. Carlo seems to be in his early 60s, white hair, mustache. He said his son was supposed to take over, but his son went to work in IT and didn't want to know about the store. Lucia knew the type of establishment. There were hundreds of them scattered around Pinheiros and the surrounding areas, neighborhood businesses that survived on the loyalty of regular customers and the owner's personality. It wasn't glamorous. It was, however, honest and concrete, exactly the kind of beginning Raphael needed. On Tuesday, when you get the documents, you go straight there, she said. I was already planning on that. I know, I'm just confirming that it's a good plan. He looked at her for a second and then looked away. But there was something different in that averted gaze. It was no longer embarrassment. It was something more like the kind of shyness that doesn't come from fragility, but from being near someone who is beginning to matter. They stayed longer than usual that morning. They talked about Ribeirão Preto, about the credit union where he had worked, about the difference between the pace of the interior and the pace of São Paulo. She told him, without intending to, that she had lived in Campinas until she was 25, before Antonio brought her to the capital. She didn't say his name with the usual coldness. She said it in a slightly different way, and she noticed it, and she did nothing about it. When the conversation reached a natural pause, Raphael said, "Ma'am, Lucia, did you lose someone?" The question was not invasive. There was in it the same honest directness that he applied to everything. She looked at her cup. "My husband, 3 years ago." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. Thank you." She raised her eyes. "Did you ask because you saw something in my face?" "Because you look at people like someone searching for someone who is no longer here," he said with simplicity. The silence that followed was long. Bernadette passed by, pretending not to hear anything. On the sidewalk, the city continued its indifferent course. And Lucia Fontanelle, who had learned over 3 years to build walls with the precision of someone who incorporates buildings, felt one of them crack from top to bottom without her having done anything to stop it. And the strange thing was that, contrary to what she had always feared, the crack didn't hurt. It was almost like relief, like when the pressure inside a closed room finally finds an exit and the air begins to circulate again. She said nothing more about it. Raphael didn't say anything either. But when they stood up to leave, there was a new understanding between them. Not agreed upon, not explained, just present, like two people who suddenly realize they are reading the same book open to the same page, even if neither had planned to get there. On the following Tuesday, Raphael picked up the documents from the agent at 10 in the morning and went straight to Martin's Construction Supplies. Lucia knew this because he sent a message at 10:42. Documents in hand, going now. And then no message for almost 2 hours, which kept her phone close during a budget analysis meeting that she conducted on autopilot. At 12:46, the message arrived. "I was hired. I start tomorrow." She stared at those 4 words for a disproportionate amount of time. There was a satisfaction in it that went beyond the good deed performed. It was the kind of joy that comes from seeing a human being regain their own axis. And this joy had a different flavor from any achievement she had celebrated in years. She replied with just one sentence, "You deserved it from the beginning." His reply took a few minutes. When it arrived, it was just 3 words. "Thanks for believing." Lucia placed her cell phone face down on the glass table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. On the other side of the glass door, Camilla simulated being very busy with her computer screen. The problem came from where Lucia least expected it, although deep down she knew it was inevitable. On Thursday night, she received a call from her brother-in-law, Dirceu Fontanelle, Antonio's brother and chairman of the company's advisory board. Dirceu was 64 years old, had a grey suit for every day of the week, and a permanent tendency to treat Lucia as if the management of the company were a temporary responsibility he tolerated with generosity. "Lucia," he said without preamble, "I'm calling because some people in our circle have brought information that concerns me." She was in the apartment, barefoot, with a glass of wine in her hand, looking at the city lights below. "What kind of information?" "That you have been seen with a stranger, a young man in a precarious situation, with whom you are apparently having regular meetings in public places." A calculated pause. At a time when the company is in sensitive negotiations, the president's public image matters. Lucia drank a sip of wine before answering. "Dirceu, I am having breakfast with a person who is rebuilding their life after a difficult situation. If that constitutes a threat to the company's image, I suggest we review what we consider a threat. I'm not saying it's wrong from a moral point of view," he continued, with the forced patience of someone being very reasonable. "I'm saying that appearances matter. People don't know this young man. They talk about interest, about exploitation. The people who say that have never been accurate in their character analyses," she said with serenity, "and I have never consulted their opinion before making my decisions. I see no reason to start now." Silence on the other end. Then, Antonio would have been careful. It was the card Dirceu used when he had no more arguments. Lucia knew it well, and she knew exactly how it burned inside when it arrived. But this time, it burned in a different way. Not with guilt, with anger. "Antonio always told me to trust my judgment," she said with a controlled voice. "Good night, Dirceu." She hung up and stood in silence before the city lights, the wine glass in hand, the whole city outside pulsing with its usual indifference. There was something liberating about that deviation of loyalty regarding others' expectations, but there was also something that hurt, because involving Antonio's name in that was a violation she wouldn't forgive so quickly. The next morning she arrived at the bakery and found Raphael already there, with a different look. Lighter, but with a subtle tension in his shoulders that she recognized. "How was the first day of work?" she asked. "Well," he said, and then, without her asking more, "Mr. Carlo is fair. The other employees received me without a problem. I learned the stock organization by noon." "You're uncomfortable with something," she said. He looked at her. There was something of involuntary admiration in the way he reacted every time she got something right that he hadn't said. "A neighbor at the hotel asked me who the woman was who had paid for my stay," he said. "I said she was a friend." He smiled the way people smile when they don't believe what they've heard. Lucia set down her cup. "And did that bother you?" "It bothered me because I thought about what people must be saying about you." He looked at her directly. "That's not fair to you." She stared at him for a moment. There was a nobility in that, a genuine concern for her well-being that was not at all performative. It was the kind of care that came from within, without calculation. "Raphael," she said calmly, "I spent 30 years being evaluated by people who wanted something from me. I am perfectly capable of distinguishing what matters from what doesn't, and the opinion of those who don't know me has never been on the list of what matters." He was silent for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. "When I was a child, my mother used to say that people who speak ill of others are the ones who are most afraid of being truly seen." Lucia felt her throat tighten in a gentle way. "Your mother seems like a wise woman. She was the most honest person I've ever known." He looked at the window. "Sometimes I wonder what she would be thinking of all this." There was an opening there that he didn't usually let show. Lucia entered carefully. "You haven't spoken to her in a long time." "I talk by message sometimes, but I didn't tell her what really happened. She knows I'm in São Paulo working." A pause. "I didn't want her to know that I had reached the point I reached." Lucia thought of her own protective lies she had told over the years. The times she had told herself she was fine, that she could do it alone, that she didn't need anything beyond what she already had. She recognized in him the same stubbornness of someone who prefers to carry the weight in silence rather than trouble those they love. "You should tell her," Lucia said, "not to cause concern, to let her know you've overcome it." Raphael looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. It was something between gratitude and recognition, as if someone had said aloud something he already knew, but didn't yet have the courage to hear. He lowered his eyes, stirred his cup, and said softly, "Maybe, when I'm more secure." Lucia nodded and didn't press. There was time for that. She didn't yet know exactly how much time nor what that time would build between them, but there was a growing certainty that those mornings at the bakery were no longer an act of charity. They were an encounter, and true encounters, she had learned alongside Antonio, didn't ask for permission to start mattering. And the truest of all, she was learning now, were precisely the ones that arrived without an invitation, without strategy, without the varnish of intention that used to cover all the relationships in her world. Raphael had arrived with a request for bread and nothing more. And without either of them having planned it, that nothing more had become something she could no longer imagine subtracting from her week, without feeling the difference. The month of March arrived with that thin and persistent rain that São Paulo uses to remind people that autumn is coming, and with it a gradual transformation that Lucia noticed in her own mornings. The visits to Donna Amelia had ceased to be a break in the routine and had become part of it, a fixed point to which she anchored herself with a naturalness that surprised her when she stopped to notice. Raphael had completed 3 weeks at Martin's Construction Supplies, and Mr. Carlo had already praised him twice in front of the other employees, which Raphael told without fanfare, almost like someone mentioning the weather, but there was a sparkle in his eyes that he couldn't completely hide. He had left the hotel on Amari and rented a room in a shared house on Rua Artur de Azevedo, near work, sharing space with 2 more tenants. It was modest, but it was his. On a Thursday morning, Lucia arrived at the bakery and found on the table, next to her usual cup, a small box wrapped in a paper napkin. Raphael was sitting on the other side with an expression that tried to be casual and wasn't. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside the box was a small jar of cashew jam, artisanal, with a handwritten label. "Mr. Carlo has a friend who sells it at the corner market," he explained. "I tasted it last week and thought of you. It feels like the same sensation as entering here in the morning. I can't explain it properly." Lucia stared at the jar for a moment. It was a gift of less than 10 reais. It was the most thoughtful gift someone had given her in a long time. "Thank you, Raphael," she said, and her voice came out slightly different than usual. He nodded, drank his coffee. They talked about the weekend, about a movie Lucia had watched alone at the cinema in Shopping Patio Paulista the night before, about Raphael's near future at work. Mr. Carlome had suggested, almost in passing, that Raphael could take on a stock and order control function, something that would better use his administrative training. "Are you going to accept?" she asked. "I already accepted." A discreet smile. "I start next week." It was at that moment that the bakery door opened and Renata Vilhena walked in. It was not a coincidence that Lucia would ever believe, because Renata didn't frequent neighborhood bakeries at 7:30 in the morning. She scanned the room with eyes that had that objectivity disguised as distraction, and her eyes landed on the two of them with the forced naturalness of someone who had practiced the movement. "Lucia, what a surprise!" She approached the table with a wide smile. Renata's eyes did a quick assessment of Raphael, the kind of assessment that tries to seem disinterested and isn't. "I didn't know you frequented this place." "I've been frequenting it for a few weeks," Lucia said with serenity. "Renata, this is Raphael. Raphael, Renata Vilhena." Raphael greeted her politely and without intimidation, which Lucia noted with quiet satisfaction. There was a confidence in Raphael that didn't depend on a position or a business card. The confidence of someone who knows who they are, even when the world tried to convince them otherwise. Renata stood at the edge of the table with the tone of someone who is just being kind. "Can I have a coffee with you?" "We were finishing," Lucia said with a smile that left no room. "But enjoy the bakery. The coffee with milk is excellent." Renata left with her smile in place and went to sit on the other side of the room. Raphael waited for her to sit down before saying, in a low voice, "She came on purpose." "I know. And you don't care." "I cared for many years about that kind of thing," she said. "It's been a long time since I stopped. It's one of the best decisions I've ever made." He looked at her with an expression that Lucia had learned to recognize in those weeks. It was the expression of someone seeing something they admire and not yet knowing quite what to do with that admiration. They left the bakery together. On the sidewalk, the thin rain had stopped, leaving the stones wet and shimmering under the sun that tried to appear between the clouds. Lucia was going to turn right to return to Alameda Joaquim Eugenio de Lima. Raphael was going to follow straight toward Artur de Azevedo. "Lucia," he said before she took the first step. She turned around. There was something in his face that she had never seen before with such clarity. A hesitation that wasn't weakness. It was the hesitation of someone who is about to cross a line they aren't quite sure they have permission to cross. He took a step toward her, and with a gesture that had all the delicacy in the world, he tilted his head slightly and placed a soft kiss on her cheek. It was not bold. It was not calculated. It was the kind of gesture that happens when feelings get too big to fit in the space that reason had reserved for them. He stepped back a few inches and looked at her, and there was in his amber-brown eyes a kind of wordless question, or perhaps an anticipated apology, or perhaps neither, and just the naked truth of someone who can no longer pretend they don't feel. Lucia did not step back. She said nothing for a few seconds. Then, with the calm voice of someone who made a decision that was already made, even before they knew it, she said, "That was not a mistake." Raphael breathed deeply. He nodded. And there was in the whole of that nod a relief so deep that she felt it almost as a physical thing, like when the atmospheric pressure changes before a heavy rain. She left to the right. He went straight ahead. And the wet sidewalk of Pinheiros was left alone witnessing one of those moments that the city of São Paulo sees by the thousands every day without paying the slightest attention. Two people who just understood that what they feel no longer fits in silence. On the way back, Lucia walked slowly, slower than usual, as if she needed more time than usual to cover the space between the moment that had just happened and the next step that would come after it. Her cheek still held the warmth of the gesture, and there was in this something she didn't want to analyze too fast, because she knew from experience that certain things fall apart when examined too soon, as if the light of reason extinguished them before they had time to take hold. The apartment on Alameda Joaquim Eugenio de Lima received her with the usual silence, but that morning the silence had a slightly different texture. It wasn't the empty silence of the last 3 years. It was a silence that contained something, like a room that had been aired out and had not yet completely closed again. She went to the window, looked at the city, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't search for Antonio in those lights, not because she had forgotten, but because there was something new happening inside her that wasn't a betrayal of memory, it was a continuity of life. And distinguishing one thing from the other was the most delicate work the human heart could do. That night at 11 p.m., the phone vibrated with a message from Raphael. Just 3 lines. "Thank you for not backing away. I've never felt so good in so long. Good night, Lucia." She held the phone in her hand for a long time, looking at those 3 lines. Then she smiled, turned off the bedroom light, and slept with a lightness she didn't know still existed inside her. The board meeting of Fontenelle Incorporações took place every first Monday of the month at the company's headquarters, on the 20th floor of a building in Faria Lima, and Lucia had presided over those meetings with the same precision since she took over the position after Antonio's absence. But on the Monday of that week, when she entered the meeting room and saw Dirceu Fontenelle sitting at the opposite head, with an expression she knew well, the expression of someone who had prepared something and was waiting for the right moment to reveal it, she knew that meeting would be different. The first 20 minutes were normal. Reports, projections, approval of the budget for Phase 2 of the Morumbi development. Lucia conducted everything with the usual efficiency. Then, Dirceu asked for the floor with an excessive formality that was in itself a warning. "I would like to bring to the board's attention a personal matter that, in my assessment, has the potential for institutional impact," he said, interlacing his fingers on the table. Lucia looked at him without blinking. "In recent days, information has come to my attention about a relationship that our president has been developing with an individual of unverified identity who until recently was homeless." He paused for effect. "Given Fontenelle's public profile and the timing of negotiations with external investors, I consider that the board has the right to be informed." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Lucia counted them internally. Then she stood up. "Dirceu," she said with a voice that filled the room without needing volume, "the board of this company has jurisdiction over strategic, financial, and operational decisions. My personal life is not within the scope of those competencies, and you know that better than anyone at this table." She looked at the other board members, 5 people who had known her for years and who at that moment were distributed between discomfort and genuine attention. "If anyone here disagrees with the management I have conducted over the last 3 years, the numbers are available. I will present the results whenever you want. What I will not present is a justification for my personal choices." She sat down. Dirceu opened his mouth and closed it. One of the board members, Dr. Helio Marques, coughed discreetly and said he suggested resuming the agenda. No one disagreed. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. When the others left, Dirceu stayed behind. Lucia was putting away her papers when he said, "You know I do this because I care." She raised her eyes to him. There was in that sentence a partial sincerity that made things more complicated than if it were pure malice. "I know, Dirceu," she said with a kindness that was real. "But caring about me and trying to control my choices are different things. Antonio never confused the two." She closed the folder. "I need you not to confuse them either." He stood still while she left. In the corridor, Camilla waited with the tablet and the afternoon schedule, but Lucia passed her with a gesture that she needed 5 minutes. She went into the bathroom, stood before the mirror, and took a deep breath. Her heart was beating faster than normal, but her expression was whole. There was a clarity within her that had not been present in a long time. She knew what she wanted, knew who she was, and was no longer willing to apologize for either. That afternoon she sent a message to Raphael. "Can I stop by the store after 6 p.m.? The reply arrived in 2 minutes. "You can. I leave at 6:30. I'll wait for you." Martin's Construction Supplies had a simple facade of worn grey marble and an aluminum door with slightly peeling paint on the edge. Inside, it smelled of cement and rubber, and the shelves went from floor to ceiling with an organization that Raphael had significantly improved in recent weeks, according to what Mr. Carlo had told a regular customer, who had told a friend who had mentioned it in passing to Bernadette at the bakery, and Bernadette had mentioned it to Lucia with her characteristic corner-of-the-mouth smile. Lucia arrived at 6:20. Raphael was finishing the closing of the cash register with Mr. Carlo, a man indeed with white hair and a thick mustache, who saw her enter and recognized her with a discreet expression of surprise that he managed to hide efficiently. "Are you Lucia?" he asked, extending his hand with a naturalness she appreciated. "I am. Mr. Carlo?" "The same." He shook her hand firmly. "Raphael told me you were the one who helped him when he needed it. I'm glad he was lucky enough to find a person like you." There was in Mr. Carlo's voice the direct honesty of someone who has no interest in impressing anyone, only in saying what they think. Lucia felt an immediate and genuine liking. Raphael finished what he was doing and grabbed his jacket hanging behind the door. The two left together into the night that was beginning to cool, with that breeze from late March that São Paulo uses to announce that the heat is finally going away. They walked along Artur de Azevedo without a specific destination, side by side, with that proximity that had grown week by week, without either of them having declared it aloud. "Did you have a hard day?" he asked. "I did, but it's past." She looked at his profile as they walked. "How was yours?" "Mr. Carlo gave me a raise." He said this with the restraint of someone trying not to smile and not succeeding very well. Lucia stopped. "Raphael." He stopped too, turned around. "I'm very happy for you," she said, and there was in those 5 words a depth that made them much larger than they seemed. He looked at her for a moment, and then, with the same delicacy as before, but this time without hesitation, he reached out and took her hand. It was not a grand gesture. It was simple, direct, completely honest. His fingers were rough from work, hers were cold from the breeze, and when they intertwined, there was a complementarity there that neither of them needed to comment on. They continued walking. The city followed around them at its usual speed, indifferent as always, but there was a silent bubble around those 2 steps side by side that made everything else a little more distant and less urgent. São Paulo rarely stopped for people, but sometimes on its wet sidewalks and in its neighborhood corners, it yielded a moment of stillness for those who knew how to find it. And on that March night on Artur de Azevedo, that moment belonged to them. Later, sitting in a simple boteco on Teodoro Sampaio with 2 draft beers and a plate of pastéis, Raphael said something she would keep for a long time. He said it without looking at her, suddenly, between one sip and another, with the quiet voice of someone thinking aloud. "I didn't know it was possible to truly start over. I thought that after a certain point life just became what was left over." He paused. "You showed me I was wrong." Lucia was silent for a moment. Then she said with the same tranquility, "You showed me the same thing." And the two stayed like that for a while, with the noisy city around them and that particular stillness between them, which was the stillness of 2 people who finally found a place where they didn't need to pretend anything. The revelation arrived on a Friday, at 3 in the afternoon, in the form of a brown envelope left at the reception of Fontenelle Incorporações, with no identified sender. Camilla brought it to Lucia with a slightly hesitant expression, the kind of expression that precedes news that the person doesn't know how to classify. Inside the envelope was a single document. It was a color printout of an article published in a business portal in Ribeirão Preto, dated 2 years ago. The headline said, "Son of Vale Fertile Cooperative founder steps away from management after internal audit." The photo accompanying the article showed a young man with dark hair leaving a commercial building. The caption identified Rafael Souza Mendes, 28 years old, son of the cooperative's founding partner, removed during an account review process. Lucia read the introductory paragraph of the article. There was no formal accusation. There were irregularities identified in internal transactions and voluntary withdrawal at the request of the board, and family preferred not to comment. It was the kind of journalistic text that suggested, without affirming, that planted without reaping, that could destroy a reputation without needing concrete proof. She stared at that sheet for a long time. Then she folded it, put it back in the envelope and tucked it into her desk drawer. She didn't call Raphael at that moment, not because she doubted him, but because she had learned over 52 years that decisions made in the first hour of a shock are rarely the best. She needed to think. More than that, she needed to feel clearly what was inside her before taking that to him. She spent the late afternoon in meetings. She signed contracts. She answered emails. And while she did all this with her usual competence, there was a part of her operating on a different plane, weighing not what that document said, but what she had seen in Raphael's eyes throughout all those weeks. The honesty, the restraint, the refusal to accept more than he needed, the firmness in saying he was going to pay back everything he had received, the way he treated the people around him, from Bernadette at the bakery to Mr. Carlo at the store. What she saw did not match the profile of someone moved by bad faith, but there was something that didn't add up. He had said he worked at a credit union in Ribeirão. He hadn't said he was the son of the founding partner. He hadn't said he had been removed. And the difference between omitting and lying was subtle, but it existed, and she needed to understand which side of that line he had stayed on. She called him at 7:30 p.m. "Can you come to the bakery now?" A 2-second pause. "Did something happen?" "Yes, but I prefer to talk in person." He was at Donna Amelia in 20 minutes. Bernadette had already closed the room to the public, but knew Lucia well enough to leave the door ajar and place 2 cups on the table, before retiring to the kitchen with a discretion that was worth gold. Raphael entered and saw her sitting at the usual table. The envelope was on the marble, between the 2 cups. He saw it immediately. He recognized the shape, perhaps, or recognized Lucia's expression. In any case, he stood still near the chair for a moment without sitting down. "Sit down," she said calmly. He sat down. He looked at the envelope and then at her. There was no denial on his face. There was something more complex, a resignation mixed with something that looked like relief, as if a tension he had been carrying for a long time had finally found the moment to be confronted. "Tell me," she said. He took a deep breath. And then he told her. The story was different from the article. Not completely different, but with the substance that the journalistic text had omitted. His father had founded the Vale Fertile Cooperative with 2 partners almost 30 years ago. Raphael grew up within that structure, worked there since he was 22. 2 years ago, during a portfolio review, he had identified inconsistencies in the accounts of one of the partners, Dr. Ferreira, who had embezzled resources over years in a gradual and careful way. Raphael took the finding to the board. What should have been an internal investigation process turned into a war of narratives. Dr. Ferreira, with more political influence within the cooperative, turned the situation against Raphael, suggesting that the young man had tried to cover up irregularities in which he himself participated. There was no proof of any of this, but the board, under pressure, opted for Raphael's removal as a precautionary measure while the external audit took place. The audit took 8 months. In the end, the report identified Dr. Ferreira exclusively as responsible for the irregular movements. Raphael was formally exonerated, but the process had cost his position, part of his reputation in Ribeirão, and, more than anything, the painful distancing from his father, who had chosen not to take a public side during the crisis to preserve the cooperative. "When I came to São Paulo, I didn't come fleeing a crime," he said with a firm voice, his eyes fixed on hers. "I came because I couldn't breathe in that environment anymore. I came to try to start over far from a story that wasn't mine, but had been stuck to my name." A pause. "And I didn't tell you because I was ashamed, not of having done something wrong, but of having been the kind of person whom circumstances can bring down." Lucia was silent for a long moment. The coffee with milk was getting cold in the cups. Outside, Teodoro Sampaio was quiet, with the distant sound of a car passing every now and then. "Raphael," she said at last, "you were brought down because you tried to do the right thing. That is not weakness, it is exactly the opposite." He looked at her. There was a moisture in his eyes that he controlled with precision, but it was there. "I should have told you before," he said. "You should have, but I understand why you didn't." She joined her fingers on the table. "I also spent a long time thinking that the things that bring us down need to stay hidden, so that people continue to respect us." She looked at him with her usual directness. "I learned it's the opposite. The people who are really worth it respect more the one who got up than the one who never fell." Raphael closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, there was a different clarity there, like someone who has just set down a weight they carried for too long. "Who sent you this?" he asked, looking at the envelope. "I don't know, but it doesn't matter." She pushed the envelope aside with a simple gesture. "What matters is here at this table." He reached out his hand slowly over the marble. She placed hers on top, and there, at the usual table, in the bakery on the corner of Harmonia and Teodoro, with the cold cups and the quiet city outside, something that had started as a request for bread reached the place it had always been capable of reaching, if the two people around it let it. Later, when they left together through the green wooden door, Raphael stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking at the bakery sign as if he were engraving the place in his memory. Lucia stood by his side. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That this corner will always be special," he said. She nodded and said nothing more. There was nothing more to say that things had not already said for themselves. They walked together along Teodoro Sampaio toward the night that was cool and clear, and there was between them the particular lightness of those who have no more secrets, of those who have just discovered that the truth, even when it takes time, always arrives. And when it arrives, it makes everything around it a little clearer, a little more real, a little more the way things should be when people have the courage not to give up on each other. 2 months after that night at the bakery, the Vale Ferti Cooperative of Ribeirão Preto published an official clarification note on its portal that had been agreed upon between the parties as part of the final resolution of the audit process. The note formally recognized that Rafael Sousa Mendes had acted with integrity in reporting the identified irregularities, and that his removal had been an inadequate measure that the board regretted. It was a dry, legal text, without the emotion the situation deserved, but it was concrete, it was public, and it was the kind of recognition that restored what judicial documents alone cannot give back, the clean name of a person who had done the right thing at the wrong time. Raphael learned of the publication from a message from his mother, Donna Celia, who sent a photo of the computer screen accompanied by, "I always knew, my son." It was the first long message they had exchanged since he had finally told her, 3 weeks earlier, what had actually happened in the last 2 years. That conversation had lasted 2 hours on the phone, with Donna Celia crying for the first 20 minutes and talking loudly for the next 40, demanding to know why he had carried all that alone. He didn't know how to answer immediately. Later, he told Lucia that the only honest answer he had found was that sometimes we protect those we love by hiding precisely the things we most needed to share. Lucia was with him when Donna Celia's message arrived. They were in Ibirapuera Park, on a Saturday afternoon with late autumn sun, sitting on a bench near the lake with 2 cups of cashew juice bought from a street cart, which had become a kind of silent tribute to the jam jar from Donna Amelia. Raphael read the message and was silent for a considerable time. Then he said, without looking at her, "I'm going to Ribeirão next week. I want to see my mother." "You should have gone a long time ago," Lucia said. "I know." He looked at her sideways with a corner of a smile. "Will you come with me?" She was silent for a moment, savoring the question. It was a simple question in form, but immense in what it contained. It was an invitation to enter a part of his life that he had guarded very carefully. It was the offer of a level of proximity that both had reached gradually, without haste, without forcing anything, and that was now there put into words with the naturalness of someone who knows the moment has come. "I will," she said. He nodded and went back to looking at the lake, but there was a visible transformation in his entire body, that kind of relaxation that doesn't come from physical rest, but from when something inside a person finally stops resisting. At Fontenelle Incorporações, things followed their usual course. Dirce Fontenelle had withdrawn into silence after the board meeting, and Lucia had not pressed for any additional conversation. There was a disagreement between them that might take time to heal, But she had learned that certain distances need their own rhythm to close, and that forcing them rarely produced anything beyond additional resentment. Camilla, for her part, had acquired the habit of leaving a cheese bread from Donna Emilia on Lucia's desk every morning, without ever having explained how she had obtained this logistical privilege, and Lucia never asked. Mr. Carlo invited the two of them to a barbecue at his house in Santo André on the Tiradentes holiday. It was a gathering of employees, family, and neighbors, the kind of event Lucia had not attended in years, and which she went to without hesitation. In the middle of the afternoon, standing near the grill with a caipirinha in hand, listening to Mr. Carlo tell stories of civil construction in the 80s, she looked at Raphael on the other side of the yard, talking with two co-workers, laughing at something with that spontaneity she had seen grow week by week, and felt in her chest that specific sensation that has no exact name, but that anyone who has experienced it recognizes immediately. The sensation of being in the right place with the right people, at the exact moment when life is being lived and not just managed. She thought of Antonio. She thought of him always and always would. But on that holiday afternoon in Santo André, with the smell of barbecue and the sound of pagode coming from a speaker in the corner of the yard, thinking of him didn't hurt the same way. It was a memory that had found its permanent place, a place of honor and love that didn't conflict with anything happening now. It was not replacement, it was continuity. It was life being the broad and contradictory and generous thing it was, when one allowed oneself not to close the doors, before there was a real reason to close them. In the last week of the month, Raphael stopped by Donna Emilia before work and found Bernadette alone opening the bakery. She handed him the usual coffee with milk and cheese bread without him asking, and said, with the corner of a smile that was her trademark, "She's still coming, right?" "She's still coming," he said. Bernadette nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had bet right, and Raphael sat at the usual table, in the usual chair, looking through the window at Teodoro Sampaio, waking up with the morning sun, waiting, and there was in that waiting a quality different from all previous waitings. It was not the waiting of survival. It was not the waiting of someone who doesn't know what the day will bring. It was the waiting of someone who knows that someone is coming, that this person will turn the corner in a little while with their purse on their shoulder and a firm step, and that when she enters through the green wooden door and sits on the other side of the table, the morning will begin the way mornings should begin. And when Lucia entered 5 minutes later and saw him sitting there with the coffee ordered and the cheese bread split in half waiting for her, she stopped for a second before moving forward, just to let that moment last a little longer than the others. Then she went to sit down, took her half of the cheese bread and said, looking at him with that direct look that was hers alone, "Good morning, Raphael." "Good morning, Lucia," he replied. And outside, on the corner of Harmonia and Teodoro, São Paulo followed with its usual speed, without stopping for anyone else. But inside Donna Emilia Bakery, at that round marble table near the window, time had its own rhythm. And that rhythm was exactly right. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Lucia and Raphael's story has touched your hearts in the same way that a simple request can change an entire life. Sometimes, what transforms us does not arrive announced. It does not come with fanfare or a plan. It arrives simply as a bread requested on an ordinary morning, and within that small gesture is everything we needed to find. If this story resonated with you, leave your like, because it tells us that it is worth continuing to bring stories like this. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new chapters, and tell us in the comments, which moment of this story stayed with you the most? Each comment is a conversation we love to have with you. Until the next story. Lucia Fontanelle's life had not transformed overnight. True transformations never work that way. They happen in layers, slowly, almost imperceptibly in daily life, and only become visible when a person stops and looks back from a point of view they didn't have before. That was exactly what Lucia did on a Sunday night, alone in the apartment on Alameda Joaquim Eugenio de Lima, with a glass of wine in hand and the city below with the usual lights. She had spent 3 years looking at that view, like someone contemplating a landscape of a place they cannot leave. That night, she looked at it in a different way, like someone who is departing for somewhere and wants to keep well what they are leaving behind, without sadness, with the kind of gratitude that doesn't need words to exist. Raphael had arrived in that city with nothing but an interrupted story in the middle, and the silent stubbornness of someone who refuses to accept that the middle is the end. São Paulo had tried to make him disappear into the crowd of the invisible, and he had resisted with the only thing no one can take from a person while they are still standing: the dignity of asking only for what he needed, no more and no less, and of looking at whoever was on the other side with honesty, even when it was easier to lower his head and leave. And it was that look, direct and without artifice, that had broken something inside Lucia that she didn't even know was intact. Because the things that really break inside a person are never the ones they feel at the time. They are the ones that grow hard in silence, imperceptibly, until one day someone looks with the right eyes and the crack appears. And when the crack appears, it is not the end. It is the beginning of what can be rebuilt better than it was before. She went to Ribeirão Preto with Raphael the following week. Dona Celia had grey hair and the same amber-brown eyes as her son, and when she opened the door and saw the two of them in the doorway, she stood for a second with the expression of someone summing up a lot of things very quickly, and then hugged Raphael for a long time without saying anything, and then extended her hand to Lucia with a simple smile and said, "Welcome." 3 words. The kind of thing that when it comes from the right person at the right moment weighs more than any speech. That afternoon, sitting on the porch of Dona Celia's house with a glass of lemonade and the smell of jasmine growing on the fence, Lucia understood what Raphael had carried with him to São Paulo and what he had found when he got there. And she also understood what she herself had carried for 3 years and what she had found on a Tuesday morning in a bakery in Pinheiros. The 2 stories were different in form and the same at the core. They were stories of people who had reached a place where the path seemed to end and who, by having the courage to take one more step, discovered that the path had not ended at all. It just turned the corner.